Let's take a couple iconic shonen MCs and put them through the same test Gon went through. Which of them could pass the Hunter exam? For this, I actually asked you guys what characters you wanted to see in it, and here are some of the popular suggestions that I liked. Kid Goku, Izuku Midoriya, Yusuke Urameshi, which feels really fitting here since we're talking about Hunter x Hunter, Yuji Itadori, with no Sukuna obviously, Monkey D. Luffy, and we have two JoJo reps in here with Joseph Joestar and Jotaro Kujo. To do this, we're actually taking each MC from their first arc, since that's going to yield the most interesting results. Most of the people taking part in this exam didn't have their Nen abilities after all. So we're trying to simulate that here. It's going to be based on their intelligence and abilities from that point, and we'll also treat these characters as if they're from this verse. So another interesting request I got is to split this up in two ways. The first is by just looking at their raw stats in their first arc. If their abilities aren't based on something they're born with, they're not going to have it. So for example, Yuji's not going to have Sukuna here, but he has his innate raw strength. Luffy's not going to have his Devil Fruit. Deku's not going to have One for All, etc, etc. They'll be taking the Hunter exam just with their raw stats. If they end up failing the exam, then we're going to be looking at a buffed version of them, either with their stats equalized to Gon, or we're going to give them their powers back. So basically, if they fail the first time, this makes it a competition of intelligence and adaptability, instead of just focusing on their physical abilities. This will give everyone a chance of passing, because as Netero stated in chapter 33, the exam does score people based on physical ability, mental acuity, and impression. It wouldn't be fair to snub a character just because they scale lower, especially with how much the scaling varies for everybody here. Since the exam changes each time, for the sake of this video, we're going to be using the same exam that Gon took. We'll also assume it has the same exact participants, so people like Illumi and Hisoka will still be threats, among others. And the exam will go all the way up to unlocking Nen, not just obtaining a license. This is part of the exam after all, so it will be included. To make things easier, on screen I'll show each phase of the exam with their pass or fail status. Of course, they need to pass everything in a row in order to get their license. Here's the phases we have. The preliminary, the first phase which is the run, the second phase which is the egg hunt, the third phase at Trick Tower, and for Trick Tower we're going to assume that whatever MC we're looking at is in the same exact group as Gon, replacing Tonpa, the fourth phase at Zevel Island, and the final phase which is that tournament where they need one win, followed up by them discovering and unlocking Nen, of course needing a teacher for that. Who has what it takes to be the next Hunter? First, we'll begin with Kid Goku. Right off the bat, one thing he has an advantage with is his tail. Since we're trying to fit him into the series, we could say he has an unknown origin either related to the Dark Continent or some sort of mythical beast. With Goku, we're not removing his powers because this is something he's born with. Him being a Saiyan is an innate trait with him. It's not something he got after he was born. Of course, if there's a full moon during one of these phases, that could be a really big issue for everybody, figuratively and literally. But his tail's really nice to have because it's an extra limb, and he might even be able to figure out how to use it for flight like he eventually did in the actual series, basically spinning it like a helicopter. And even without that stuff, Goku's already advantaged to begin with. In terms of attack power, right in the first arc, we see him crushing boulders, lifting and destroying cars, defeating huge animals, and just overall being a real menace. He's pretty fast too. Roshi stated he should be able to run over 40 miles an hour, and it's hard to gauge his combat speed and reaction speed here, but based on animals he's fought, he seems to be at least subsonic. Beyond those stats, he's obviously a prodigy and is able to copy things really quickly, and he's lived in the woods alone for years, so he has the survival instincts and skills that he needs too. Overall, I think it's really safe to say Goku could pass the entire exam with no issues at all. None of these phases really pose any sort of challenge to him, and really the biggest issue is him being able to turn into a grade 8 because this could happen at any time and that would really screw things over. Although mostly for the other contestants, not really for him. If Hisoka antagonizes him, that would be an issue given his strength at this point, but I don't see him or Illumi getting in his way at all. The craziest part is this is all pre-training. Literally right from chapter 1, Goku's just him. Next we get to Deku. So this one's pretty interesting because we're looking at Deku being quirkless here. It's a bit hard to scale chapter 1 Deku in terms of feats, and he probably wouldn't pass this. So we're going to be using him post-training, after going through all the training for One for All. Also, this is just fair in general because every other MC here basically has some sort of physical gift or prior training, and Deku's really the only exception. So this is kind of a necessity anyways, due to chapter 1 Deku probably failing right off the bat, and the lack of feats and lack of fairness. And I thought after his training, maybe it would still be a challenge for him. Deku doesn't really seem too strong in comparison to the others in his verse, at least on the surface. But then when I started looking into it, I realized he's cracked. Like, scary cracked. I'm doing a rewatch of this series right now, mainly for some other videos, wink wink. And while I've scaled some things from this series before, I was never really familiar with scaling for the first parts of it. I never paid attention to it. The whole reason I'm going on this tangent is because Deku's scaling surprised me so much that I decided I'm going to make a completely separate video scaling him without a quirk. That'll be coming out soon. By the way, if you're liking this so far, be sure to drop a like. It lets me know you want to see more like this. This is just to convey my shock at how strong he is. Like yeah, if we use him pre-training, he's probably screwed. He's a below average guy. He's pretty intelligent, but he's a quirkless, weak kid. But with his training to prepare for his quirk, his stamina, speed, and power are actually pretty high, especially when you consider that he was doing decently well in his training at UA without using One for All much. Like by regular human standards, he's the strongest person on Earth. So for one, his stamina is really high. He always pushes his body to the limit constantly and isn't stopped by extreme pain. And he's got incredible willpower. That's going to be really helpful for this exam. In combat, he's supersonic and his reactions are even faster. His travel speed's much lower, comparable basically to an athlete. But in combat, he really shines. And none of this is due to One For All either. He even tells All Might at one point that he only gets a small boost from it. He can't even control 5% of it at this point without breaking his bones, and he rarely does use it. And humans in My Hero Academia are just strong by default for some reason. Even a certain character later on becomes quirkless and is pulling off good feats. I won't say who, but if you've read that far, you know. And look at his training with All Might. He's carrying a nearly 600-pound All Might. He cleaned up an entire beach, which includes moving a truck on his own through sand and other trash. He's taken point-blank explosions from Bakugo, who's building level at worst, and has traded blows with him too and knocked the wind out of him. And this is all kind of lowballing him. Again, I plan on making a completely separate video for this just because it's interesting to me. But his raw stats are really impressive, but the most impressive thing is his brain. Not only is he incredibly battle smart, he's just relatively regular smart in general. Especially in a setting like this, he should really excel. He's incredibly driven, he's motivated, he's got insane willpower, he's got the raw stats to back all this up, and he's a really analytical and adaptable fighter. For that reason, I think he actually makes it through the exam fairly easily, at least looking at him after his training. And he'd definitely be able to unlock Nen at some point. We saw how quickly he was able to learn and adapt to a quirk, especially one as complex as One For All. Learning and controlling Nen wouldn't be an issue for him. Next up we have Yusuke, and full disclosure here, I only just started watching Yu Yu. I'm about 3 arcs into it. Thankfully this video is only based on the first arc of each series, but I've also never scaled anything to do with this series before, and I don't know if there's some info I'm going to leave out, like some world-shattering reveal later on that actually does apply to the first chapters. Like for example, people finding out Goku's a Saiyan, which changes the entire context of the manga before it. I don't know if there's any of that here, so this is solely based off of what I'm seeing in the first arc. If there's some sort of inaccuracy because of that, that explains it. Anyways, based on what I'm seeing, early Yusuke actually kind of struggles with this. He has a lack of experience and how he carries himself. I think at this point in the story, he's not really too fit to be a hunter, and he's on the weaker side of these characters that I've chosen as well. I wanted to include him here because, despite me not finishing the series yet, I'm really liking it so far, and it has the same author as Hunter x Hunter, so it feels really fitting to put it here. He definitely has the potential to be a good hunter, but pre-training, it's going to be a bit tough for him to pass the exam. I'd say he probably makes it through the preliminary, and he definitely has the stamina for the run. He has the guts and bravery for the egg hunt, but I feel like beyond that he might face some sort of struggles. There's definitely a higher chance that he's going to lose the tournament, for example. For Trick Tower, I'd say maybe it's 50-50. And for Zevel Island, it's going to be really tough, especially up against the people that he's going to be facing. So let's take him after he does his training. If we equalize his stats to Gon, who actually scales a bit higher than him, or if we just flat out give him his spirit abilities and say they're Nen abilities instead, I think his strength after training definitely will help him here, and he should be able to pass it. His attitude and nature might still pose some sort of issues here, but he's definitely capable of passing it, especially post-training. So even though I feel like he'd fail if we just take him right from Chapter 1, he would definitely have a decent performance and surely would have the potential to eventually unlock Nen. I think his issue here is really he's just too green. I guess that's kind of a pun. Next up, Yuji. Of course, no Sukuna here. But like I said, biological things are allowed to stay, so I'm not going to be spoiling anything for the manga here, but we do get more info about Yuji's past later on. If you know what I'm referring to, you know. So that explanation for his strength, it stays here. But even right at the beginning of the series, Yuji is freakishly powerful. Not to mention, Yuji's perseverance is really going to help him pull through here, combined with his physical prowess. So right in the first arc, before he even gets Sukuna, it is made very apparent that Yuji's really strong. Right off the bat, it's stated that he could reach speeds of nearly 40 miles an hour, which makes him the fastest human on Earth, by a pretty big margin too. We don't know his reaction speed or combat speed here, but if his travel speed is that high, likely his reaction and combat speed is much higher, because that's usually how it goes with those things. He even was fighting a cursed spirit that was destroying his school, and even Megumi was impressed by his strength. We could say he's around small building level. I think Yuji would pass the exam pretty easily. Zevel Island might be an issue, and maybe the tournament as well, given how strong the people are that he's going up against. But the first few phases definitely aren't an issue for him, and his perseverance alone should help carry him through a lot of this. And in the end, I think he should be able to unlock Nen as well. Next, we'll look at Luffy. You might think Luffy's pretty disadvantaged here by me removing his Devil Fruit powers, but even if you take that away and just look at Luffy right at this point in the story, he's still pretty strong. The reason I say this is because of his backstory stuff with Ace and Sabo. These kids are freaks of nature. And I know Luffy had his Devil Fruit powers at this time, but he didn't use them much because he couldn't use them well. It took him a while before he could even throw a proper punch with those powers. As for Ace and Sabo, we know for a fact Sabo didn't have a Devil Fruit here, and Ace presumably got his after he left home. Granted, we know Ace is just strong in general, especially due to his parentage, but still, these three share a lot of feats together and are pretty much relative. Like, they outran a tiger and beat it up, and it was a pretty giant one too. And remember, we're using Luffy from East Blue, we're not using this kid Luffy. If he was that strong as a kid, imagine how strong a hypothetical 17-year-old Luffy would be if he didn't have his Devil Fruit powers. Of course, weaker than normal, but he still should be freakishly strong, at least by normal human standards. He even does have some feats without using his Devil Fruit too, like during East Blue we see him outrun an explosion. As for his attack power, of course some of it is buffed by the fact that he has the Devil Fruit, and can give his attacks a lot more momentum and such. But at very worst, I think without a Devil Fruit he'd be large building level, and that's being really conservative. It's a pretty huge step down from where he is at this point in the story with his Devil Fruit. Frankly, I'd argue he's even higher. But even being conservative, he's really strong for this exam, and he should be able to make it through with no problems. Like, he has the personality and mindset to make it through fine, his strength and speed aren't an issue, he's got good battle IQ, and I think he would make a good impression. Not to mention, he'd be able to unlock Nen in the end. He seems to be a good learner. Next, Joseph Joestar. Since we're using the first appearance of everyone here, naturally this means we're going to be using part 2 Joseph. The one issue with this is the fact that a lot of his power is derived from Hamon, even though he does seem to be naturally strong regardless. However, Joseph has also been stated to just naturally use Hamon well, and has done so from the get-go. And even using Hamon is just really a breathing technique. The efficiency with it seems almost like something he's been born with. Still, he hadn't mastered it by this point, and he also doesn't have a stand. So obviously we're not going to be using Hermit Purple here, but I was debating on how to adjust Joseph here. Although Hamon being kind of a natural thing to him, and just based on breathing, it could kind of fit as is. Like, I don't think it's unreasonable to treat it basically as a form of martial arts here. We could assume his physical power is just as it's shown, and we'll just remove the weird aspects of Hamon, like how it affects water, for example. Of course, he's strong as is, Hamon just buffs him further. Either way you look at it, Joseph is a favorite to pass this exam as is. His raw power, even without Hamon, should be pretty good. His charm and personality could really help him go far in forming relationships with other hunters here too, so he probably won't be on anyone's bad side, unless they think he's too full of himself or something. But the most important aspect of him that I think will really carry him here is his mind. I don't need to tell you how smart and resourceful Joseph is. This is like his defining trait, at least in part 2. I'd even go so far as to say out of all the candidates here, he's probably the smartest and most adaptable. Like, not that the others are dumb. It's just, first of all, Joseph is more experienced, he's the oldest of any of them. But Joseph is just stupidly smart too, and it's absurd how quickly he could think and act, as well as forming plans for things. Like, maybe I'm glazing a bit. I love Joseph, he's my second favorite JoJo behind Johnny, but I don't think it's unreasonable to say he could probably pass this really easily. If we look at the different phases, none should inhibit him. Preliminary's fine, the run is fine, the egg hunt's fine, Trick Tower is built for him. Same for Zevel Island, I'm sure he can form a great scheme to get badges as well. And with just one win needed in the tournament, he should be fine. Even if we make him a little bit weaker without Hamon, I think his natural strength as is should be good enough for this. Unlocking Nen would be his biggest challenge because his attitude would need correcting, like we saw his training under Lisa Lisa, so some of that would apply here. But in the end, he should be able to get it, it just would be the hardest part of the exam for him. And to finish off the video, one more JoJo, Jotaro Kujo. Just like Joseph, we won't be giving him his stand unless he fails the exam. Technically, he was quote-unquote born with the potential to have a stand, but it required Dio's awakening for it to awaken as well. While it is related to the Joestar bloodline, he only manifested it after the fact. And since it requires that external force, plus the fact that he gained it so late into his life, we'll assume that he doesn't have that here. Which isn't a problem because thankfully he actually does have some feats without his stand too, and JoJo characters don't get absurdly strong with stands anyways. Although Jotaro is kind of an exception because a lot of his stand is just raw power, but he does have some feats on his own, feats applicable to Jotaro, not Star Platinum. It's not like we're taking a Galaxy Buster and nerfing him here. Jotaro without Star Platinum still is pretty strong. Like at worst, he's actually somewhat comparable to Gon in terms of strength and maybe a bit slower, but that's like at worst. Stats wise, he should be pretty fine here. Superhuman speeds, really quick reactions, although some of that might be attributed to Star Platinum, but also his raw power just as Jotaro is pretty good. Like he beat up an orangutan easily and sent a man flying with a kick into a garage. He breaks a metal chain with no effort, and like one other really funny feat my friend brought up to me, it's the fact that when he was a kid he'd beat up a Lessie. Even as a kid, he could beat up a grown adult. So I think normal human Jotaro is more than fine here in terms of stats. And multiple times within JoJo, across all the parts he's in, he's been shown to be really smart. He's a great strategist, he's dependable, he's really good at tricking opponents, and just in general, he's a pretty intelligent guy. Personality-wise, he definitely has the willpower to make it through this too. Just like Joseph, I say he makes it through this pretty easily. In the end, I think it's at least important to note that these MCs all should be able to unlock Nen. After all, in Shonen, it's pretty common for MCs to go through hero cycles like this or just development like this in general, passing some sort of test or training to unlock their crazy powers. They're literally built to be capable for that. And these MCs, they all have that. You may have also noticed I overlooked one thing in the preliminary. Honestly, I think that would be the hardest part of this test, not the ship part or the part with the Kirikos. Assuming everyone takes the same exact test as Gon, how would they react to the question about saving someone? Each of these characters has a different outlook on something like this. I went through the video assuming they'd all passed the preliminary to begin with, but this is the defining moment. To answer this question correctly, you need to stay silent. but would any of these characters actually do that? I could see Deku picking up on the trick question. Same for Joseph and Jotaro, especially the latter, he'd probably choose silence regardless. But as for the others, what would they do? Goku, Yusuke, Luffy, and Yuji, would they possibly try to answer the question in their own way? They're outspoken, and especially for someone like Luffy or Yuji, they have an immense determination to save others close to them, in their own ways of course. This isn't a fault for any of these characters either, and I'm not implying they're dumb for missing the trick question. The whole point of the question is to trick you, and to provoke you. But it does make me wonder if they'd fail from the start because of that. It really speaks to the nature of who they are. Would this simple, thought-provoking question be what makes them fail? It almost happened with Leorio. And for a good reason too, he didn't want to answer the question. Not to say they'd have an explosive reaction like this, but probably some reaction. One that isn't silence. We could power scale all we want, but at the end of the day, if you don't pass this question, you don't get into the exam. And this question is the perfect example of what it takes to be a hunter. It's meant to provoke the heart and mind, and for that, it's tough to say how they'd respond. I would like to think they all answered this correctly, but just some food for thought. Their unique aspirations and personalities, that'll decide how they answer this. Even if some of them might not be able to pass certain parts of it right away, or if they at least struggle with it, in the long run they definitely have potential to be hunters. They all have the heart, dedication, the potential, the battle IQ, all the factors needed to eventually unlock Nen through training once they find their teacher. And as you saw, most of them were able to pass. A good chunk of them went through it really easily as well. But that isn't to downplay what Gon and his friends did. It's just these verses start out kind of strong to begin with. But remember, personality, mindset, and intelligence also play a huge role here. And that's the thing that all of these characters have in common, particularly sharing this with Gon, as well as other successful hunters. Let me know what you think below. Do you think some would struggle more? Do you think it would be easier for some of them? And also, would you like to see another one of these? I only covered a handful of MCs here, and there's way more I could talk about. So if that interests you, let me know below. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.